Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you so much for joining us this Sunday evening. We've got a great show tonight as usual. We'll go one-on-one with Barbara West, the highest ranking black female officer in the Chicago Police Department's history. Can we invent our way out of society's biggest problems? A local doctor and entrepreneur thinks tech is the key to solving the dual epidemics of gun violence and COVID-19. And is Lovecraft Country on your pandemic binge watching list?
We have to work together in order to make the world work.
And beekeeper Thad Smith has a honey of a metaphor for you in a new feature called The Last Word. But first, some of the top stories from this past week. Chicago's former police superintendent Eddie Johnson is facing allegations of sexual assault from an officer who once reported to him. In a lawsuit filed in Cook County Court, Officer Cynthia Donald claims that for 3 years, Johnson's unwanted sexual advances included being forcibly kissed and touched, forced to engage in sex acts, and Johnson texting nude photos of himself to her.
After the first time he sexually assaulted me in his office at CPD headquarters, he told me that I belonged to him. He referred to me as his girl. At times when I was able to avoid his sexual advances, he would tell me, "You got away this time." Eddie Johnson repeatedly abused and harassed me and made it clear that I had to follow his orders.
The plaintiff in the case is the same officer with whom Johnson was seen drinking with for hours at a downtown bar a year ago before Johnson was later found asleep, slumped over behind the wheel of his car. In a statement from an attorney, Johnson adamantly denies the accusations. Chicago Public Schools says it plans to begin a phased-in approach of returning students to the classroom. Sometime in the second quarter, which begins in early November, the district hopes to bring pre-K students and those in cluster programs for special education back to the classrooms. Schools Chief Janice Jackson says the return is a matter of equity. New data shows those students are among the least engaged, and their enrollment numbers have plummeted, especially for black students. The Chicago Teachers Union remains against the idea, with concerns about rising case numbers and building ventilation systems. And early voting began in all 50 wards of the city this week, with just over 2 weeks to go until Election Day. The city calls this an historic election in part because of the massive number of people applying to vote by mail. Now, if you choose to vote in person, the Chicago Board of Elections says safety measures and restrictions will be in place. And be sure to visit our website for a whole slew of voting resources, including a map of early voting locations and voting frequently asked questions that are available in English and Spanish. And up next, one-on-one with the highest-ranking black female officer in the Chicago Police Department's history in a conversation recorded before those allegations against former police superintendent Eddie Johnson were made.
Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, is made possible in part by Fifth Third Bank and by the support of these donors.
At Fifth Third, we believe when diverse voices are heard and empowered, communities are made stronger, lives are made better, and the future holds greater promise for all. That's why we're proud to support Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can drive change.
After more than 25 years on the force and 10 months as Chicago's #3 cop, Deputy Superintendent Barbara West is retiring from the Chicago Police Department. Since January, West has overseen CPD's Office of Constitutional Policing and Reforms, which is responsible for implementing court-ordered reforms imposed by the January 2019 consent decree. West is also retiring as the highest-ranking black female officer in the department's history. And CPD Deputy Superintendent Barbara West joins us now to talk more about her career and policing in Chicago. Welcome to Chicago Tonight, and congratulations on your next chapter, Deputy Superintendent.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with and be here tonight with you guys.
So you were just promoted to oversee reform just 10 months ago. Why are you retiring now?
Well, it's just a matter of, in terms of timing, someone once told me that you will know when it's time. And given, my personal experiences that I'm having, and also with, timing as far as where I'm at in this position, having, been involved with the consent decree since we began to negotiate it after the Department of Justice came out with their report, and then we began to negotiate with the Office of the Attorney General. I've been there since the very beginning. So, at this point in time, the negotiation has been done with the consent decree. We've gotten through 2 reports, as well as we've been able to rebuild the team for the consent decree. It was just a perfect time.
So as you know, it's been a tough summer between the police department and communities of color in particular. They already had a very strained relationship. What's your reaction to how that relationship may have deepened over the summer with regards to how strained it is?
Well, we always have to do and work towards building community and community trust. And so I think as we develop these partnerships with community in terms of how we're going to police with our practices and procedures, I think that we will be in a much better place in terms of policing moving towards and in the future. The strain, I guess, is occurring throughout the country. And it's not just a recent strain, as you know, it's a historical strain. But again, I think the change that we want to see is by building that trust again with the individuals that we police, and that we police together in terms of how we want to be policed and how people want to be policed. I think that's where we make the difference.
What's your reaction to what we've heard a lot this summer, the calls to defund the police department?
Sure, I guess that's maybe not necessarily a call to defund, but a call for maybe reform. And so CPD, Chicago PD, is actually working through, as you know, we're working through the areas of reform. We're reforming many of our policies in terms of community policing, use of force, crisis intervention. We're reforming our training. We're reforming how we engage with the community. So I think it's more about reform and not so much as defund in some of the narrative that we're trying to, push out that we're trying to reform.
So your department oversees reforms and compliance with the federally mandated consent decree, of course. But a report in June showed that the department has missed more than 2/3 of deadlines. Why would you say there have been so many?
Sure. So you think about, consent decrees work is not necessarily done overnight. And when you compare, if we were to compare ourselves to other agencies that have gone through consent decree, I think we have the most extensive one in the history. So we've got 799 paragraphs of work. In order to make things to sustain, I think you need to develop like systems, right, and processes and policy and training, and then make sure you have accountability mechanisms and ways to self-audit yourself in terms of making sure that the change stays. It's not just a one and done or check the box, but it's a sustainable reform that will continue on past the end of a consent decree. That's what you really want to see. So that actually takes time. I think it takes more than a year. As you know, the consent decree was signed March of 2019. This is 1 year. Into 1 year and some months into the consent decree now. And so building those systems and building a system that is sustainable is important. I think it's more important than getting it done quickly, but getting it done right. And that's what we've tried to do in terms of making sure that, we've engaged the community more in terms of our policy development. We've actually went out to.
And Deputy Superintendent, sorry, because
Yes.
there's part of that I want to get in here. So this summer, you announced a community working group to review the department's use of force policies. Here's a bit of what you said at the time.
Sure.
I want to promise you that this time that we spend working with this working group, that CPD's use of force policy and training will not be wasted. We know the value of these conversations, and we know that appropriate use of force is more than just a policy.
Deputy Superintendent, what would you say has come out of that working group so far?
So the working group is finishing up making their recommendations to the Chicago Police Department. In fact, after I get off the phone with you, I actually have a Zoom call to discuss with them the recommendations and go through that process. So they're just finishing up their work. As you know, we've been actually reviewing and revising our use of force policies since 2016. We've actually put them out in the public for their comment. We've actually invited subject matter experts as well as that we do have this actual working group that's in place right now.
So those recommendations, it sounds like they're coming. We've got about 10 seconds, and I have to ask you this last question. My apologies for the interruption.
Yes.
You're retiring as the highest ranking, black woman in the CPD. What advice would you give young black women in the ranks right now? Very briefly.
Well, I would give, young women in the ranks and young black women in particular, to always make sure that you are at your best. I think that, and always be a fighter for the things that you find to be right, true, and good, and have integrity in everything that you do.
Words of advice.
I think yes.
Words of advice from Deputy Superintendent Barb West on your way out. Best of luck to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, that was a conversation recorded earlier in the week before allegations of sexual assault against former police superintendent Eddie Johnson were announced. It was also recorded before activists expressed their disappointment over the handful of use of force recommendations that CPD adopted from a task force convened by the city. Up next, a conversation recorded earlier with a doctor who's using technology to help solve public health issues. A Bronzeville native and former trauma surgeon has made public safety through technology his business. First, by developing metal detectors and scanning equipment to prevent gun violence, and now by developing non-contact thermal scanners to protect against the spread of coronavirus in schools, businesses, and even Chicago's City Hall. Joining us now to talk about how he believes technology can help get us back to work and school is Dr. William Yates, founder and owner of Yates Protect. Dr. Yates, thank you so much for joining us here on Chicago Tonight.
My pleasure.
So you began your medical career as a trauma surgeon. How did you make the shift from that into making metal detectors for public buildings?
It was actually kind of easy. As a trauma surgeon, as you know, what you do is you repair people and prevent trauma. You're doing a lot of work on the back end. I was more concerned on the front end and actually preventing and deterring violence. So I always thought, and it's a very simple thought, that in an airplane terminal, no one gets shot. There's a reason for that, because there's a metal detector, there's an x-ray machine, and somebody kind of pats you down. So I took this same thought and started developing this and promoting this citywide, nationwide, and I think every school needs to adopt this to deter violence, because for violence, you have to have an opportunity. So this for sure deters violence.
You'd also had some personal experiences with gun violence, though.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm a Chicago native. I grew up on the South Side, and when I was in college, at one time, walking my dog, something as simple as that, somebody took a random shot at me and asked me to come to their car. And of course, I said no. And always you think, oh, if somebody shoots at me, I'll duck and do karate and jump through the window. But when that happens, you just freeze. And luckily they missed. So I knew that gun violence is a big deal in Chicago. Even for me in the 80s, it's even more big deal right now.
What role do you think metal detectors should play in public safety?
I think they should play every role. I think they should be in every school, every municipality, every government building. They should be everywhere. And again, no one gets shot in an airplane terminal. Use the same common sense. A lot of parents are against it because they say the optics actually give their kids the thought they're going to jail. But again, most of the time the kids go through a metal detector, where are they going? They're going to Disney World. So they don't think they're going to jail.
But there are some metal detectors, obviously, that exist in a number of schools. How do you respond to that criticism that by installing metal detectors in schools sort of fosters that prison-like atmosphere at schools?
Well, the main thing, most people who are at schools have never been to prison. So the kids have never seen a prison. So they don't even have a benchmark to know walking through a metal detector means anything about prison. That's totally the parent's bias. And if you have a person walk through a metal detector in a non-discriminatory manner, meaning everybody goes, not just one person goes because they look suspicious, and you apply it the same way, I think it's a beautiful thing. My kids are grown now, but if they were not, I would insist the school have metal detectors.
So similarly, you also pivoted during the COVID pandemic to making a variety of non-contact temperature sensors. How are public buildings and businesses using these now?
Oh, they're using them phenomenally, and they work well because they promote social distancing. They keep you 6 feet away. They measure your temperature accurately. They measure it very fast. And we know with COVID, most people, the most reliable symptom, and even if you look at Trump, he had a fever. The people who are asymptomatic, unfortunately, you're not going to catch them, but you'll catch everybody else. So if you can catch everybody else, why not do it?
How do you respond to concerns that these devices, especially those that include facial recognition technology, that they are an invasion of privacy?
Well, that question has been answered by the FDA, the EEOC. Anytime there's a pandemic, all these social right issues get relaxed. So it's not even an issue if you do facial recognition at this point and take somebody's temperature. It might be in the future, before the foreseeable future, saying the next year or so. I don't think we have to worry about that.
So it's not a slippery slope then?
It's not a slippery, it's not even a slippery slope or a gray zone. It's purely black or white. It's okay.
Do you think these devices have utility beyond the pandemic whenever something like normal resumes?
Oh my God, yes. What we found that just infectious disease alone, just like the flu, cuts down a number of working days. People who have the flu will have a fever as well. So anybody going to work should not have a fever. To have a fever, it means your hypothalamus is receiving a signal that you have a bacteria or a virus. So anybody that has a fever should not be allowed to go to work. After the coronavirus, with the coronavirus, in all time, in perpetuity. Fever, you stay home.
A little bit about yourself before we run out of time. You're a South Side Chicago native. What was your childhood like?
My childhood was probably the best time in my life, now that I think about it. I grew up in a place called Lake Meadows, where a lot of middle-class Black people grew up. My parents were teachers, and they stressed the opportunity in America that they would always tell me, just get your lesson and you can do anything you want. And they were exactly right. So it was a very safe neighborhood. I have great friends. They're all doing well. And I love Chicago. And
here you are today. Our thanks to Dr. William Yates for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's more Chicago Tonight Black Voices just ahead. But first, to Paris Schutz and what's on tap this week.
Brandis, we've got a lot coming up this week. Mayor Lori Lightfoot releases her plan to close the city's massive budget gap. And as voters head to the polls, we have the latest on the upcoming election. That's this week at 7 here on 11.
Since its premiere in August, the HBO horror series Lovecraft Country has lit up social media, not only for the ample scares it delivers, but the very real stories from civil rights history woven into its narrative. Many that happened in Chicago. Here's a look. Joining us to unpack the hidden history in Lovecraft Country, and just as a warning, there will be a few spoilers and it might get a little scary. We've got architecture critic, photographer, and author Lee Bay. Lee, welcome back and thank you for joining us. There you are. I think the classic Zoom mute. There you are. So what's the premise of the series?
Well, the premise of the series is sort of twofold. That there are monsters among us, and there's sort of the typical adventure. You're gonna find out the root of all that, but it's also layered on top of real life American racism, and by putting the two together, and with this predominantly Black cast, you have them running from monsters and racism and racists with equal kind of abandoned. I mean, both of them are both as dangerous as the other, and sometimes the monsters and the racists are on the same side, to kind of thwart our heroes of our story.
We just saw a clip earlier of 4 children using a Ouija board. Can you explain that reference for us?
Well, that was one of the most chilling parts of the series so far. So the kids, the grown people are having a party downstairs. The kids are upstairs and they're playing with this Ouija board, which is a means of which you can use to talk to the other side, if you will. And one of them is a male kid who's nicknamed Bobo, asks if he's going to have a good time down south in his upcoming trip. And the Ouija board tells him directly no. What's chilling about that is, and revealed in the other episodes, Chicago was the nickname of Emmett Till. And in fact, the actor is wearing the same kind of striped tie that Emmett Till wears in the famous picture of him before he passed away. Of course, we know Emmett Till's at the hands of Southern racists down south ends up being this horrific thing. His mother allows him to be photographed, and these ghastly images give spark to the civil rights movement.
Right, yeah, that scene is a very powerful moment of symbolism in the show. That same episode features a brief mention of Trumbull Park, which was a Chicago housing development. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was interesting. There was this scene in which Letty, Mrs. Smollett,
Jurnee Smollett,
her character has bought this big house in a white neighborhood. Exactly. So Jurnee Smollett, I almost said Jussie, obviously, buys a house in a white neighborhood, and the racists don't like it. And they set fires. And her sister, in this fleeting reference that Chicagoans would get, says, "Oh, this is just like Trumbull Park all over again." Trumbull Park is a housing project in the southeast side, 104th and Oglesby, that kind of thing, and it was white. It was a white public housing project in the 50s. CHA Housing Authority rented an apartment to a black family, which they typically didn't do that. They kept black people in black developments and white developments. But the thing about it, how it kind of references this piece in ways, the story in a way, is that the wife, Mrs. Howard, Betty Howard, was light-skinned, and they didn't recognize that she was black. Not until the family moved in, and then they saw, the CHA saw, and the neighbors saw, and there were nights and weeks and days of rioting and fires to try to get them out of the house. So it was that, and that would have been right around the time, within a year or two, of where this story is set in Lovecraft Country.
Now, we don't have a whole lot of time left because there are some other historical references, Gordon Parks images and sort of references to those. But, beyond that, the themes of racism and horror, they seem to work fairly well together in this series. Why do you think that is?
Because racism is a horror. And police brutality, being set in Chicago, so Chicago police play a role in this as well. And without giving away too much, the police or a faction of the police and the monsters are league with each other and fighting each other at one point. And racism is a horror. And racism, if you're African American, feels inescapable in many cases, just like the inevitable monsters in a monster movie.
Yeah, and we're looking at what is a fairly scary scene. So we've got just a couple of seconds left. But regarding the Tulsa Massacre, which we didn't really get to talk to, but there is another moment in the film, something else that happens that I want to share a quick clip of. Okay, and unfortunately, we don't have time to ask you about it, Lee, but I think you know this. The singer in that song, it's an opera that happens in I think the last episode was written for the show, sung by a Chicago performer, Janai Brugger. So we're out of time, though, but thanks so much for joining us, Lee Bay, as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
And finally tonight, we're debuting a new feature that we're calling The Last Word, in which we hand the mic to Chicagoans and hear what's important to you. For our first installment, beekeeper Thad Smith offers his thoughts on honeybees, native bees, and working together.
I am Thad Smith, and I'm a beekeeper. We talk about honeybees all the time, but there's a question that I've come up with. Are honeybees a pollinator or are they a colonizer? And I've come up with that they are both. However, they are more colonizers than they are pollinator. Why do I say that? Honeybees were brought over to exploit the resources in which they have, and that's honey. My people were brought over here to exploit their labor resources, and this country was built on their backs. When you look at the trajectory of this country, honeybees and slavery, it's the same thing. It was always built upon some other labor. And so now when we talk about the colonization, the honeybees have completely cut out the native bees. Here in Illinois, there's about 800 species of bees that do the pollination here that we have completely forgotten. So what do you mean by that? So think of Walmart as a honeybee. We have completely forgotten about the mom and pop stores that we used to go to, all the little stores that used to sell on all these little streets, 47th, Milwaukee, Pilsen. Those are all gone now because everybody goes to Target. Everybody calls Walmart. Just when we talk about the honeybee, we only hold that up like it's going to save us, but there are 20,000 species of bees on this planet that we don't talk about, and we need to start talking about them, especially in these times. So honeybees are good, native bees are good, but we have to work together in order to make the world work.
The last word. And that's our show for this Sunday night. Join Paris Schutz and me tomorrow at 7 on Chicago Tonight. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, representing dozens of families in the crash of a Boeing 737 MAX 8 jet. Mr. Clifford has been named lead counsel in litigation in federal court in Chicago.